Hello, everybody. Research has shown that singing has tremendous health benefits, lowering stress, boosting immunity, and connecting us with others. But are there specific ways that singing can help us when we're grieving? And what role do lyrics and poetry play? Welcome to Singing Through Grief, the Power of Poetry and Song. I'm Liesl Dawson, and I'm really pleased to be joined by our fabulous panel. Dr. Carrie Etter, poet, author, and academic, and my colleague and friend. Samir Savant, a singer and CEO of St. George's, a world-class music and spoken word venue. And Kate Branch, head of music at UWI, and lead researcher for the Sing for Happiness project. So just a reminder, this conversation is being recorded and will eventually make its way onto our YouTube channel, the Grief channel. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and you can also ask them in the chat, although sometimes they go by a bit quickly. And also feel free to share observations or ideas in the chat, and to talk to one another, really. Okay, so to start us off, I'd like to turn to Kat. And can you say something about how singing benefits our mental health? What does it do?
Sure. So the fascinating thing about singing in terms of mental health is it works across a few different areas. So there's a kind of physical, physiological area, and then a kind of mental, psychological, emotional area. So in the kind of physical, physiological domain, we've got brain chemicals, so evidence of dopamine, endorphins, oxytocin, cortisol levels being lowered. A really interesting study showing that when we're singing as opposed to speaking, the right brain is engaged. When we're speaking, it's the left. Now, the right brain links more to the limbic system. That's memories, arousal states, emotion. So lots going on with the brain. Increased tolerance to physical pain when we're singing. And when we're listening to our favorite music, that's particularly where the dopamine comes in. There's also work with the muscles, release of muscular tension, relaxation in the body, improvement in breathing capacity, posture. So plenty there that will support our mental health with the body. But the mental and psychological areas I'm particularly interested in, where we see singing helps your mood in the actual moment. So this might be feeling more energized, feeling more mindful, and certainly with the Sing for Happiness project that I'm leading the research for, we're seeing an improvement of about 20% across those areas in my initial analysis. Singing reducing mental distress, right from people with postnatal depression to people who are suffering from cancer, and of course, people who are bereaved. Another key factor here is connection. So non-verbal, fast bonding, perhaps a transcendental spiritual quality, sense of a shared experience, and a sense of being included and part of something. Often people who might feel more excluded can feel included singing in a group. And the last part here, supporting mental well-being, is within a sense of worthwhileness and meaning, what I might call the eudaimonic value, where we have a sense of achievement, of learning something new, rising sense of optimism, hope, and something that's intrinsically valuable. So singing has plenty to offer, and I'm pleased to say that none of these effects are mitigated by whether or not someone is a good singer. That is happening across about 20 different studies I've summarized for you there in all kinds of different groups and settings.
Fantastic. Samir, you talk about this topic quite a lot too. I'm thinking about your Instagram singing guru, and I wonder if there was anything you wanted to add to what Kat has said about the way singing is good for our well-being.
I'd just like to, from a human perspective, really. I've been singing since I was 10 years old, and there's clips of me singing on the Singing Guru, which is on Instagram. I was invited to give a TED talk last November on SS Great Britain here in Bristol, why singing is good for you. It's part of our collective human endeavour, which will will go online in the next few weeks. But it's just, I mean, it's wonderful to have the research from Kat, because it kind of reinforces for me as a human being why singing should be so important for me and for fellow singers. And it's just in a way that the research is wonderful, it's the science, but singing is still this kind of quite elusive, esoteric kind of activity, and people just love doing it. That throughout the Sing for Happiness project that Kat and I have been working on, 400 singers have signed up here in Bristol, and a third of them haven't sung as adults, and they're coming to it for the first time, and they just love doing it. And it's almost unquantifiable. It's wonderful to put the science and the research around it, but there's something quite kind of intangible about it as well, which I find incredibly moving, and helps me connect to fellow singers and to wider society.
Matt, do you want to explain a little bit more about the Happiness project, actually singing project, just to give people the background who don't know about it?
Absolutely, yeah. So what we wanted to do, Samir started an annual event here in Bristol through St George's called Festival of Voice, and we were talking about singing for well-being and my research specialisms, and he said, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if we could try a project with so many singers here in Bristol to get some more data?" Because actually, the research that's out there about how singing can help is often on quite specific groups. So a lot of the studies I've just quoted in my opening sort of 60 seconds are dealing with, a homeless choir in Canada, or people with particular illnesses, things like that. So we wanted to see if we could just open up singing for like anyone who wanted to take a punt, especially encouraging people who might have excluded themselves from singing, because singing is one of those where I run a lot of singing activities at the University of the West of England, and when I say, and now we're going to try something with the voice, you can see the kind of terror and pale faces that appear. So we wanted to see if we could include people who might otherwise have self-excluded. Would we still see the same benefits? So we were measuring people's mood in the session itself, so before and after, to get that sense of that instant feeling of, do you feel uplifted, that sense of enjoyment, and what I would call kind of hedonic enjoyment. And then we were doing a long measure over the scope of the project. So people only met 5 times and then did a performance. But this was great because it meant that people who were like, well, I can't make a weekly commitment to a choir, could see themselves participating in this, because it was only just, I'll sing 5 times and then sing on a stage. So we measured people's well-being at the very start and at the very end on a longer well-being measure. And so I still haven't analysed this data, but I'm anticipating seeing quite a good improvement on the way people feel about, does my life have meaning? Do I feel loved and connected to other people? Those kinds of measures, because we know that singing does something really special in that space. So that's what we're going to be exploring, and then I'll be doing some focus groups as well, because what I really want to hear are people's stories about what the process has been like. Samir and I and other people involved with the project have heard some really moving things about how people have experienced it, and it's interesting because whilst I've talked about uplift, many moments in Sing for Happiness have been marked by tears, by a feeling of emotional release. But in a very positive and held way, a sense of a sort of shared emotional release. In fact, if anything, I'd say that's a stronger characteristic than happiness per se, but we couldn't call the project Sing for Release or Sing for Catharsis, because I don't think anyone would have come.
Thank you. That's a really good sort of, it encapsulates what you're doing. Samir, can I ask you about your more personal experiences of grief and the role that music has played for you in the grieving process?
Absolutely. So I've been very open about my personal grief. Over 3 years ago, I lost my husband of 25 years. So aged 50, I was widowed, which I really wasn't expecting. And Michael had been ill for a while, so it wasn't a great surprise. It wasn't an accident. He died, medical causes. And because I've been singing so much, music was so important to me, both in terms of my choir in London, who I sang with, and my late husband Michael used to come to all my concerts, and the choir knew him really well. And in fact, the conductor of the choir came to me and said, "We want to do a concert in Michael's memory. Will you allow us to do this?" And he and I came up with a list of pieces that I love, that I knew that Michael loved, pieces that had meaning, pieces that were sung at our wedding, for example. And it was tremendously, just that bond. And I had complete strangers in the audience in this concert, when I explained why we were doing the concert, come up to me and hug me, and I just, it has that kind of universality which I was talking about. And also in this country, we're not great at expressing emotion, so for me to be able to just completely wear my heart on my sleeve through singing, and oddly, I didn't cry at all in that concert, because I was just so focused on kind of keeping it all together and getting the notes right and singing tune, all this kind of thing. But I've found singing incredibly cathartic, more listening to choirs. And if you just allow yourself, very much what your whole project is about, Lisa, like the good grief, it's an energizing grief, it's a positive grief. And I still cry when I listen to particularly choral music, because it just, a trigger goes, and I just allow myself to sit here and sob, and it's just really energizing. I just feel I'm a human being. I'm not denying my loss, because one thing is kind of when you move on from grief and you're reconciling yourself to your loss, I feel I can still feel, I'm still feeling the pain, but in a kind of, not in a kind of sinking, kind of dark way, but more in a kind of, this man was incredibly special to me. The music bonded us together. And I know a link that will be shared is to a concert that I gave here in Bristol with my new choir tribe, because again, coming to a strange city, I moved to Bristol from London for my job, as a widowed person, single again, but within 2 weeks I was recruited into this choir, and they've become my best friends. And we gave a concert, 6 of us gave a concert, for Good Grief, and it was around music has kind of codified grief. So I picked music that was written 500 years ago for very high state occasions, the death of a monarch, the death of someone very important. And then we brought it right through to pieces that were much more personal, written by composers in the 20th and 21st centuries. And we kept it quite light as well towards the end, because the most popular song at funerals is My Way. So we sang a version of that, and that's obviously a very uplifting song. And the individual singers also picked poems that meant a lot to them, that they'd heard read at funerals, which were meaningful to them. So that mixture of spoken word and song, but the poems were incredibly personal to the individual singers, and the feedback we got was great, mainly around how kind of brave people felt we were, being incredibly vulnerable and personal, but we felt shielded in the music, we felt protected, if you like, in the music, we felt we were all in it together. And then when we came off, you didn't see this, Lisa, but when we came off the stage, we were completely in pieces. We'd held it together for an hour, and then we just collapsed. And again, some of these people I know very well, but some of them I don't. And just to be incredibly vulnerable together in that moment, all through music, was incredibly powerful for me. And it's been a very healing process for me to carry on singing throughout this entire grieving period.
Trine, if you're able to pop the link in where people can listen to the concert, that would be really great. And I think it was an incredibly beautiful concert. And I think it was amazing also to have singers who shared a bit of their life. And it made the music feel so connected and so personal. And everyone who sort of left seemed tearful, but also kind of ecstatic and moved. And again, that feeling of community and connectedness. And the song, I always forget, is it Blue Skies that you played? That was at your wedding? Am I remembering that right, Samir?
Yeah.
Which again was, music that brings back a glorious, joyful memory. And it was as if the rest of us who weren't at your wedding nonetheless could sort of share in that moment and that feeling. And it was, yeah, really, really powerful. Carrie, can I turn to you? Um, so in the concert, there were poems as well as the music. Really interestingly, when I spoke to the singers, they found reading the poems was actually in some ways tougher than the songs because they're kind of used to performing songs. They're used to getting into that zone, whereas the poems were kind of somehow felt a bit rawer and there was more them. And I wonder if you could talk us a little bit about kind of writing and poetry and whether you think there are mental health benefits to that kind of activity or whether they're different.
Thank you. Yes. And indeed, I nearly jumped in on when Kat was reciting all of the studies that, show all the benefits, because the same story is true for writing expressively or creative writing. It has both physical and mental health benefits. And there have been multiple studies to this effect, from kind of people being able to combat stress or disease more easily if they engage in creative writing, improving their immune and hormonal function, as well as making fewer physician visits for illness. And so this way, I think this is the thing, is that whatever your creative way in is, that there are ways of kind of contending with the stressors and grief in our life in creative ways that nourish us, that help us take care of ourselves. And that's proved so important in my own life. I mean, I don't like to think of myself as kind of a poet of loss. But both my third book, Imagine Sons, about giving up my son for adoption when I was a teenager, and my most recent book, Grief's Alphabet, about my mother's unexpected death the day before her 66th birthday. Um, but I think that also says something about what I find in poetry, that work of that sustained engagement with loss has nourished me, and taking that work into the world, both through readings, through the book being out, seems to reach others as well. And I find that so heartening when, getting messages back from people who've been reading the new book saying, this is, I so related to this, even as my poems were so individual. Um, picks up, I suppose, what you're saying about the people who read poems and said that the poems were more difficult in the performance. That, I tend to think when I'm writing these poems about my own grief that they'll shut other people out in the first instance. But in fact, those are the very things that other people respond to, and they say, the work, this was so relatable, this is so much like my own experience of grief, or so much like, me being at my mother's bedside at the end. And I'm just always in awe of that, how much that kind of work resonates across the wider community, and creates a community in that respect. That sense of me putting my words out in the world. And I think the same thing with the songs, and hopefully Kat and Samir will teach me to be a braver singer by the end of this session. um that that sense of putting the work out there is part of that work of creating community, because
Yeah.
you make yourself vulnerable, other people relate to what you say, they feel like they can be vulnerable too, and the community grows.
Can you give us a bit more of a background to Grief's Alphabet? So this is the current book and
Pretty.
the kind of origin of this book. It's about your mum, but could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So she died in 2011. Um, as I said, the day before her 66th birthday. It was unexpected. She was misdiagnosed. And I flew back from England. And another issue of this is being the daughter who lives so far away. I flew back from England to my hometown of Normal, Illinois, to take care of things, work with my sisters to settle everything, give the eulogy, arrange the funeral, everything else. And it was actually on the flight back that I wrote down this phrase, grief's alphabet, in my journal. And I started thinking about, like, how do I find a language for grief? How do I begin? Because this was the greatest loss of my life. You know, my mother was my best friend. And I had no idea how I was going to face this of all the things I had faced. This seemed like the greatest challenge I'd ever met. And so over some years, I would occasionally, you know, I guess a number of poems a year would write poems in response to this grief. Um, but it was just a few years ago that I started kind of seeing, I've there's a manuscript here. And one of the great things about finding there was a manuscript here is, while a lot of the poems about grieving and about her death were already written, one of the things I had to do was I had to write about our relationship to be able to show you what I lost. So the most joyous part of writing Grief's Alphabet for me is the first half of the book about our relationship, because that I put into words what I had. This incredibly, you know, the most generous, unjudgmental person I've ever known was my mom. And how lucky, and I'm adopted. I was adopted at 2 weeks old. And so something about the kind of good fortune of becoming her daughter in this very accidental way, I was able to actually kind of put into words and put out in the world, which has been so important to me.
That's beautiful. Do you want to read us a couple of poems? Are you
Yeah, and
happy to share?
you've helped me pick some, which I appreciate, Lisa,
Yes,
because it's I should say, I'll show you two. The book has pictures. So this is me and my mom, and I just love the joy in our faces, in this and other photos in there. And it was really nice to be able to bring that into the book. Um, so I've said, I'm adopted, and the first poem is called Birthday as Adoption Day. I tore open the chrysalis, or burrowed out of earth, blink in the shock of light. I took worm from beak and cried aloud. I pulsed through river, my gills a tremble. I struck shell to sunder. A nurse settled me in your arms, and with we, I began. This is perhaps may seem like one of the most agonizing poems, but it also is one of the joyous poems to write, because it's one of the ones that really conveyed what an incredible person I got from my mother. Pregnant teenager and her mama. You eat and tremble. You tremble and eat, and your mother watches you like a mouse, a cat. She swoops in like a bat. You hope to be claimed. She alights beside you. Your hands turn, palms up. Apology. Kangaroo. She plucks and drops you in the warmth of her pouch. What'll I do, you think? No need for speech. Her tongue's on your fur, or her love's your skin. The year's a crucible, and here she is, a doe who leads her fawn to water and waits. How she waits. And the last one I'll read, which is also, oh, thank you, about the kind of relationship we had and how special it was. Um, Also gives you the clue as to the choice of the cover, which will be more familiar as an image to American audiences who know about cardinals in their lawns at winter, and was a typical image for me kind of growing up in Illinois. That's the last one I'll read. Thank you so much for listening. Homing. Back from California, back from England, I, with my mother, became we. If snow blanketed the yard, we saw a cardinal settle on it briefly. Brilliant red, sharpening the wine. If rain fell, we lingered and chanted in the rooms where it could best be heard. In summer, we breakfasted on salted melon, ate corn on the cob with dinner. In winter, orange cinnamon tea fragranced the air. For most lunches, we traveled to find another enclave, ideally a booth, where we could sit and relish General Cho's chicken or toasted bagels with red onion cream cheese or BLTs on sourdough. We drank large glasses of iced tea. We talked about how this grandchild/nephew aced the state math test, how this daughter-sister liked her new job as a teaching assistant. And we talked like this for days. I was like that red cardinal on the white lawn, easy in brightness. Except I was too. We.
Beautiful, Carrie. You have some really lovely comments coming out in the chat.
Well, I look forward to reading them.
Simone said, it's amazing how songs have different meanings when you've experienced grief. Billy Joel's Lullaby is about a parent singing a child to sleep. Now I weep when I hear it. It feels like I'm saying goodbye to my husband, wishing him sleep and rest. So poignant and powerful. And I think it's a really interesting point how songs and poems and lyrics can kind of hit us in different ways. There's also this one about Grief's Alphabet. I've loved Grief's Alphabet. I'm an American who's lived all my adult life in the UK. My brother died during the pandemic when travel was restricted. Writing poems about him felt like stealing extra time with him.
Oh, wow.
Grief's Alphabet has that feel about it. It's astonishing.
That's wonderful. And I have to say that is, I suppose, I hadn't put it in those words before, but I think that's something too, is I felt like writing these poems allowed me to spend more time with my mother. That I got to go back into these memories and back into our relationship. And not only do I understand her better for writing the poems and understand what we had, but when I get a chance to read Homing, I'm back at those lunches we had. And we'd have those endless glasses of iced tea they always refill in the States. And we'd just be, there was no end of conversation, even however banal it was. We always had more to say. So yeah, I love that comment. I'm really glad that someone has found Grief's Alphabet speaks to them in that way.
Can music do this as well? Can music be a way of spending time with someone, do you think? Someone who's died?
I really think so. It's funny because, Carrie, when you were reading that last piece, I think I put in the comments that because you use so many descriptions of shared foods and drinks, made that
There's
so
a lot
vivid.
of food in my poetry, but I think there's so much about family around food, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. Although, do you know what was how I responded to that was as you spoke, I could imagine the tastes and the smells, which the reason I'm talking about this and linking it to music is because as we all know, that smell memory is the strongest, memory evoker, isn't it? And so you can smell the smell and your emotions are awakened immediately. So even if it's not to an exact memory, but there's an emotional response, isn't there, to the smell and to some extent the taste. And so when we think about how strongly emotional memory can be triggered, there's nothing to beat smell, actually. It's the number one. But music is just underneath. And so when we hear music that means something to us in a memory way, we feel the feelings again like an echo. When we with smell, you feel it almost like you're there again, but music is like a sort of shadow memory emotion. But what is beautiful about it is that we feel. So sometimes with visual memory, the emotion is lower. I don't know if anyone has found this. It can be eventually lower, but music is there enough to touch us again and to make us feel again.
There are a number of poems in the book where I refer to kind of my mother's musical tastes. There's a poem, Arrival, where I walk into the house and I hear John Denver's voice because my mother was a huge John Denver fan and met him 3 times. So
Wow.
yeah, it's and so every time I hear, on Muzak in the States, you hear a lot of John Denver in particular. And, anytime I hear, it's just, I'm back. Immediately I'm thinking it's her. And there's something about that immediacy of music, I think, that I tried to get in some of the references to music in the poems as well.
I so get that. Yeah, I so get that. I really, Ty said here in the chat that, how you don't have control about what things mean something. And you said there, Ty, the cheesy pop songs can now bring you to the brink of tears. It's true. Because it's the memory and the context that makes it, isn't it? And music actually works in the memory in a different way. Some people here may be aware of what music can do in the dementia space, and if anyone has suffered the loss of someone to dementia, my granny died from dementia, and she was a big opera fan, and this was the one bridge that we found when she didn't know me anymore, but she still knew all the arias. So I would go visit her and put them on. And she had long forgotten me, but that never left her actually. And so
it's amazing. And music's so visceral as well. It's a little bit, it's not smell, but it does kind of hit your body. It is an emotional experience. It's sort of embodied emotional experience. And some of the people in the focus groups for grief and the happiness choir talked about how the music plugged them back into grief in a way that allowed them to cry. And, almost that sense of holding the emotions in, but the music was the kind of button or the valve that opened them up to these feelings. Yeah. And I think it's interesting how it changes as well, because we did have a few people talk about songs that they actively avoided, that there are periods of time when actually the song can be too painful, rather than something comforting.
Yeah. Yes. In fact, if in some of the really hardest parts of a grief experience, some people experience, a sort of clinical level of depression, and actually, listening to sad music in that time is a bad idea. It's shown to make people feel really quite a lot worse. So I think generally we might self-regulate that. It might be like, you won't touch a hot oven. It's like, that's too hot, it's too painful, and we regulate away. But if we're not able to do that, it's helpful if we've got people around us to guide us away from those triggers until it's a different time in the process.
Safe space. Carrie, is there anything you need to do to support yourself if you're writing about grief and your mother's death? Are there things you have to put in place to make sure, you're okay?
No, absolutely. I was just going to pick up, think about what Kat just said. I have, all these kind of, I have my mom's former John Denver CDs, and I couldn't play them for a while. I just couldn't go there. And sometimes when I'd hear one off guard, sometimes it would just be a little too much. I do think that's been a really important part of the process for me with writing this book, has been pacing out the work sometimes. I mean, of course I cried, writing the book. Of course I cried loads. But I also knew, one of the things I love about social media actually is all the different people I know I can access on chat. And so I know that I've got friends around the world that I can reach out to, that there's somebody there I can talk to if I need to. And there are various friends I would reach out to when I was writing the book, and I'll just say, I drafted a poem and I would be in tears, and I would just kind of, either phone them up or type a message in chat, and that was really helpful. But also too, sometimes changing the kinds of work I wrote about. Like, some of the poems that were hardest to write were right around her immediate death, and going back and writing the poems about our shared memories allowed me back into that joy, that kind of pleasure of feeling like I was with her again and I was re-experiencing those moments. And so sometimes it was also a matter of remembering the good things, remembering the positive memories, not just what I'd lost, as a way of working my way through the writing, but also working my way through my own grief.
Oh, that makes sense. What is it about singing together in a group? What does that do to us? It seems different from just singing on our own. And do you have any sense? Samir, do you want to come in on this? What do you?
Well, again, I'll talk about the kind of the human aspects, or the kind of the natural aspects, but my favorite hormone is oxytocin, so I'll let Kat speak about that. But if you think about, like, when you're in a group and you're singing, the things that, because as I say, in our Sing for Happiness project, and by the way, we are definitely doing it all again, as Kat says on the chat, at Christmas and then next year, and we'll just carry on doing it while Kat and I still have the patience. But the acoustic at St George's in Bristol is amazing, but we also do an online choir. And there is an ongoing online choir run by Ben England here called Home Choir. So if you just Google Home Choir, they regularly do online sessions. If some of you are not in Bristol or wherever you are, you can join Home Choir. And I can't forget what. Oh yeah, the act of singing together. So you stand next to people, you end up breathing at the same time as they do. You really tune into other people. You listen, all these things really, and it's having a subliminal effect on you, and you're not aware of it, but you're sharing this same experience. And then when you stop singing, you realize that you've had so much in common with all these people in the room. And one thing I used to do when I was introducing the Sing for Happiness in-person sessions is always get people to turn around and speak to their neighbor, because that obvious thing of, like, again, it's a very British thing not to talk about it, not to emote, not to share, but I thought it was really important that people actually acknowledge their neighbors and kind of felt that, okay, we've gone through this experience together, and hopefully we'll go and grab a coffee and we might talk about it. But that kind of thing, the act of communal singing, and from a socio-historic point of view, why is that we always sing, across all world cultures at moments of importance, whether it be weddings, whether it be funerals, there is music, there is usually singing. There's also singing on football terraces. There's also, singing spontaneous, but not so much in Britain, but in other cultures, spontaneous singing, for example, at the end of a meal. In Georgia, there's this wonderful tradition at Georgia, in the old Soviet Union, not Georgia, in America, or maybe they do that in America as well. But particularly, there's this particular tradition at the end of a meal, you all stand up and sing, and people just kind of make toasts and sing more. So there is a place in society for singing. But I'll let Kat talk about all the wonderful stuff around hormones. That's extraordinary what happens to your body when you sing.
Thanks. Yeah. Yes, well, I feel like my bit sounds a lot more boring now, Samir, after your beautifully personalised description. But there's, I think, from a research point of view, we're trying to understand what that mechanism is. Like, why is that happening? What that sense of, almost a spiritual connection. So definitely the serotonin response, which is seen in some cases, we know that would help that kind of friendly, relaxed feeling. And again, other studies where we've got oxytocin, that's that really nice bonding one, kind of like a breastfeeding mum might feel that one. I think Samir often likes to talk about when you're stroking your dog, you know, that's that same feeling. So we can see that's happening. And I think there's something about the non-verbal quality of singing together that's quite unique, because the social energy we put into interacting with each other can be difficult. And if we're experiencing strong and painful emotions, that makes it even harder. There's no space for small talk in those states. But singing together just mitigates all of that. You don't have to do any of that. And in fact, if you've gone to a group, you don't even have to think of what to do. You can really take a break from all of that mental load. You can just hand it over to another person, but at the same time, you're not doing that alone. So there's this participatory element where you're making something beautiful and making these sort of new shared experiences. And there is something special about communal singing that feels meaningful. I know I said this at the beginning, but it's this sort of, it can be really hard to find things that feel meaningful and worthwhile, and what's the point? You know, that feeling of what's even the point? But then when we sing together, suddenly it feels like, I don't really know why this feels meaningful, but it does. It feels like something important about the human condition is happening as our voices join. I mean, if there's harmonies going, there's chills effects and all the rest of it, and that really amplifies the brain response as well. But it's special and it's unique. Although I would just say, I noticed there's just a quick comment to Sabrina. You talked about, from a selective mute point of view, that group singing isn't for you. But nevertheless, you find singing alone helps with your anxiety and depression. I'm so pleased to read that, because I'm a massive advocate for group singing, but really keen to say that any form of singing, any way you can do it, you in the shower alone, that is still going to give you some of these benefits. So thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely. It really struck me when I was going through some of the focus group material that on the one hand, some people found singing a complete escape, and some people found, and maybe even the same people at different moments, an entry point into something quite intense. I have a quotation I'm just going to read, which I thought was really interesting. It was somebody who's bereaved and who is having a lot of rumination, repetitive negative thoughts. And this person observed about the choir. I don't think it allows you the space to have negative thoughts or intrusive thoughts. I think once you're there and you're immersed, there's no space for it. And then by the time you finish, you kind of forget that you were feeling shitty and having these negative thoughts beforehand. And people talked about the kind of earworm of the song as somehow softening the earworm of the trauma, of the death, of the thought. So that was really interesting. And then on the other hand, people talked about going in, the emotion of the grief taking over and being the space, a safe space where they could really cry and feel. So it's interesting that music has this sort of flexibility in terms of your own orientation and maybe what's being played, how you connect to it.
Yeah, it's so interesting, that quote, Liesl, because in fact, I'm sure you're familiar with some of the other bereavement choirs studies, but interestingly, the experience of being able to have paradoxical things happening quite quickly, things that are not rational, things that are not really making any sense, might ping quite quickly, was described by participants as just so helpful, because it's so hard for that to feel normalized in other contexts, and it can feel very confusing and disturbing. But then in the singing space, because it's held and there's room for all of those contradicting feelings among individuals, but also for an individual to be pinging around, be having different reactions, things that don't make sense, strong, difficult feelings, uplifting feelings at the same time, and for that all to be okay.
Kind of co-present.
Yeah.
And I've got
And
one.
sorry, I just wanted to,
yeah, go on, Samir. Yeah.
I was just going to say to Kat's point about mindfulness as well, and grief is exhausting. It really is. And if you've got something that when you almost, again, subliminally, unconsciously, you're taking your mind into a different place, you're having to focus on words, tune, breathing, and that's all taking your body into a different place. And it's really interesting with the study that Kat's doing, that one of the questions is, how tired do you feel and how energized do you feel? And a lot of people say, well, they're reasonably tired because after an hour, well, actually it's 3 hours, isn't it, Kat, or 2.5 hours of singing, and just the physical act of standing, posture, breathing, concentrating, it is tiring, but you feel energized at the same time. You know, I always say when I leave choir, I feel as if I'm walking 6 inches above the ground, because that's literally the feeling that I have, even though I might come home and sleep. You know, the other thing is sleep, isn't it? Sleep inducing, because it's good tiredness because it leads you to sleep. But you know, it's fascinating how we're giving our brains you know, a rest, because grief just is all encompassing. It's this heavy weight on your chest. It's occupying your mind, all these things. So I think both, you know, creative writing, poetry, either writing or listening, certainly singing, listening, or taking part, you're just giving yourself a break, really.
We are getting to the point of questions, because some questions have been coming in from the audience. But I wonder if, Carrie, before we move to that, if you were willing to read a couple of more poems for us.
Well, it so happens that I do have one. One of the ones I'd chosen was one that references some of my mother's musical tastes. So this one is called The Maudie Box. I try to remember all there is to remember. I labeled a box file the Maudie Box. Maudie, my first name for her. Inside, letters, cards, photos, postcards, post-its. My mind is another Maudie box. Inside, her fondness for French burnt peanuts, the time she cried when the radio played Anne Murray singing You Needed Me, ticket stubs for John Denver and Peter, Paul, and Mary. The upright piano she never played, never urged us to learn. I collect and collect the novel from her bedside, bookmark never to advance, the framed photo of Pope John Paul II that disappeared from our dining room wall, a predilection for TV's reality talent shows, home refurbishment. I cannot stop. Is it too late to become a better daughter? Yes, it is too late. Still, And the last one, which Liesl chose, is really poignant this particular month because the 29th of July is the day my mother died, and the 30th is her birthday. And so July is a month for me, as comes up a number of times in the collection. The long summer. Come July, roses, lavender, sweet pea. Tipsy I go on color, on perfume, till brought to a pause at a pool of silence. Memory. Your face floats up. Come your birthday, I wade in. Thank you.
Oh, and I do love the way the poems think about absence, but also evoke presence and these moments of, you know, sort of evoking her. She seems to be there. We've had so many lovely comments. I wish I had time to go through them, but I don't. But we appreciate them. We're thinking about them. We also have some questions that have come in. This is one for Carrie. It sounds as though you may have been encouraged to drop your armor in writing about your loss. Do you have any thoughts on how to help with this process? I'm trying desperately not to lose my words in the face of my friend's decision to end his life.
Oh, that's I empathize. I don't write about it in this book, but I write about elsewhere a friend of mine's suicide at the age of 19. And it's something I'm writing about a bit more now. One thing that I find helpful in writing poetry is that I think sometimes when we first try to write an elegy, we try to put everything we feel and remember in a single poem. But one of the joys of doing a whole book was isolating individual moments and different aspects of our relationship. So there are poems where, you know, when I got the news of her death, when I gave her the last kiss. But there's also an ode to tuna casserole, because I learned how to make her Midwestern tuna casserole here in the UK, with this and that, and it's my comfort food. It reminds me of her. It reminds me of growing up. And so one thing that can be helpful is, you know, not trying to do everything in a single poem. Um, and also including thinking about those kind of positive memories that you might write about as well. Write about the grief, of course, write about the loss, but also those moments that you cherish. Put those in poems, and then you've got them. You've got them in words forever. I mean, that's another thing that's a treasure too, is you've got that record. And that can be really powerful to have to hand. Thank you for your question. That's really good. I hope that helps.
I have a question about keening wailing. Can you share your thoughts on keening or giving sound to the raw state of grieving? So this is the kind of Irish, you know, tradition of the vocal lament, which you also had in sort of ancient Greek traditions as well. Any thoughts about keening, wailing?
You know, I was just revisiting some of the papers about bereavement choir specifically, unlike just communal singing, which could involve people with lots of different experiences. And there was some amazing comments in there about that, because singing, you're putting volume into your voice and you're kind of making a big noise. And then a big noise is going on, that some people had commented that they'd been free to allow grief sounds that weren't crying. I think keening would be the right term, to come out in the safety of that space, because everybody there understood the situation. So there was no judgment, or nor was there any need for any commentary. And interestingly, one participant said that they didn't want anyone to come and talk to them or, you know, do anything. They were just in that body of sound and could safely let that noise come out in a safe way, and was the only way they had been aware of, really, to be able to do that. In other words, you have to do that privately, don't you? Because it feels weird.
It strikes me that keening also allows for the kind of fury, the anger, the frustration, you know, like a different, because like a lot of grief is about anger, actually. And it's harder to sing angrily. But like, it seems to me keening is that kind of, it's on the line of, you know, lament, but furious lament. And damn you for doing this and leaving, and you know, so I think it allows for elements of grief to have expression in a communal way that are usually probably kind of taboo.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Carolina's just said, like in the singing context, it's good for that to be a space. But I have to say, this was occurred particularly only that I've seen in bereavement choirs, where everybody understands.
Yeah.
I feel like that would be harder in a general communal singing space because of
I feel like
that taboo element.
Yeah, I feel like we should just mention some of the singing grief choirs out there. I've always really been interested in Sing Their Name, the choir in Manchester, which is for people who've been bereaved by suicide, which looks amazing. There's Our Stars Baby Loss Choir, and someone on the Facebook Good Grief page got in touch and talked about a project in Belgium, which sounded amazing. where they started organizing consolation concerts in local cemeteries. So they kind of come together and play music in the cemetery, which again seems like a really beautiful way of getting a community together and singing and remembering. If people have others, do put them in the chat. I see there's a laughter yoga. And oh, I see in Plymouth there's a choir for bereaved children and adults, which also sounds really lovely. So it's great these things are happening. I have a few more questions if we have time. I use music and several poems to release sadness and tears. Is there any research on this too? I find it very helpful. I mean, there's certainly research, I would say, on, the fact that you need to kind of feel grief in order to process grief. So that anything that helps you do that, I think, would be beneficial. Carrie, were you going to
Yeah,
jump
I
in?
just wanted to speak anecdotally to that, because when I first lost my mother, I experienced a depression of about 4 months and was afraid to cry because I was afraid I wouldn't stop. And one of the things that I got through the process of writing about it was I was able to properly grieve. It allowed me to know that I could cry, and I had other feelings besides sorrow. I knew that again. And so, yeah, I think that's really, that kind of creative expression in one way or another, I think is should be a natural part of the grief process, the grieving process.
We have a question about sound baths. I'll do this one and then I'm going to do one final one from me, which I want to squeeze in at the end. A variety of sound baths recently, gongs, crystal bowls, handpans. The practitioners often talk about cellular vibrations and how they can release emotions. Do you think the physical vibrations generated in the vocal cords chest when singing kind of act on a similar cellular level?
I think I feel really unqualified to say about that because it's not really my area. I love the idea of it as a person. I'm interested by the idea of that. And certainly when I'm singing or when I'm listening to music or listening to live music, I love the sensation in the body. Which I know isn't really answering your question about cellular level, but I think I just, I think I feel a bit unqualified to say, but definitely vibration good. I do think, yeah, there's comfort
Okay.
there, isn't there?
Yeah. All right. I want to finish with a question I have, which is singing and writing for audiences often require that we're in touch with our emotions, but also that we use this more analytical side to self-consciously craft something artistic. So it's both emotional, but it's also technical, it's analytical at times. And I just wonder about this possible coexistence or oscillation between these emotional states and these more crafting modes, and whether anyone can speak about that in relation to kind of creativity and grief.
Who first? Kat? I think we're both ready.
Yeah, I was going to let you speak, Carrie, because I'm aware I was just talking, so please.
No, I mean, I think that act of that analytical side is part of what is conducive to being able to understand one's own grieving and being able to appreciate what you're experiencing, because it gives you just that little bit of distance that you need to be able to see it, to understand it, to feel it. And so I feel, really, grateful that I have this available to me, that, that this is kind of my natural way of being in the world, is writing poetry and fiction about my own experiences. And I think I would have been at a great loss without that to deal with my grief.
That's so. I would just, yeah, what you said. It's funny because there was a question in the chat about somebody said, "Oh, how can we gently reintroduce music when people are grieving with a non-curative cancer diagnosis, or a person living after multiple compounded grief without space to grieve?" This person asked, and it was that exact process you've just described, where when you're doing something, the doing, whether it's the writing, the crafting the words, or making the music with your voice, or even playing an instrument, honestly, it's the same thing. It's almost like you can put your hands in and touch, but it reminds me slightly of that idea of when you put, in a sort of irradiated box, you can put your hand in a glove. So you're in, and you're there, and you're touching, but you have that, it's just, the cognitive process just mitigates slightly, just giving that distance and giving that sense of control, that sense of empowerment, because as the crafting process, in whatever art form it is, that effort is restoring that sense of efficacy and control. And so that feeling of I'm going to be overwhelmed and I'm going to drown in this torrent that I can't deal with is really, I think, beautifully balanced by that analytical process and makes it possible to touch safely things that otherwise feel too frightening.
That's beautiful.
That is, those words, empowerment and efficacy, I think both of those really resonate with me for kind of what the crafting brings to my relationship to grief.